My name is Jack Spittler. My real name actually is John J. Spittler. I'm senior. We have a junior, John J. Jr. Uh, First of all, I want to thank Doug Frutel for having the idea of putting this thing together. All of my kids, when they heard about it, were incredibly glad that this was being done. I don't know why. I don't know that my life has been that interesting, but it's been long. I'll be 90 years old my next birthday. And these are probably the last words, the last recorded words that I will ever say on this earth. But you can believe that I'll be looking down and watching out for you. And whenever you hear a clap of thunder or a bolt of lightning, you'll know that I'm thinking about you and that you better change your ways. One of the people over in our beauty salon where I get my hair cut once or twice a year mentioned that when you find a bird's feather when you're walking around, be sure and pick it up and mount it on your cap or put it in your pocket, because it's your loved one dropping it down from heaven and signaling to you that they are watching you and have you in mind. This is an old Cajun idea that I think is remarkable, and I have saved a number of those because I know my darling Mary Jane is up there looking down on us. The other day, a young person asked me how I felt about being old, and I was kind of taken aback by it initially because I don't think of myself as being old. Upon seeing my reaction, this young lady was immediately embarrassed, but I explained that it was an interesting question and that I would ponder it and let her know. And then I decided that old age is a gift, and I am now probably for the first time in my life the person I have always wanted to be. Well, not my body. I sometimes despair over my body, the wrinkles, the baggy eyes, the sagging butt, and often I'm taken aback by the old person that lives in my mirror. But I don't agonize over those things for long. I would never trade my amazing friends, my wonderful life, my loving family for less gray hair or a flatter belly. As I've aged, I've become more kind to myself and less critical of myself. I've not necessarily become less critical of others, as Doug knows, but I've become my own friend. I've seen too many of my dear friends leave this world too soon before they really understood the great freedom that comes from aging. Whose business is it if I choose to read till 4 o'clock in the morning? Whose business is it if I decide to have that extra drink at a party? But I will dance with myself still to those wonderful tunes of the 40s and 50s. And if I at some time wish to weep over a lost love, I will. And there will be occasions during this interview that I will probably break down, because as I think of the lost love of Mary Jane, the lost love of my mother, who incidentally was born on Christmas Day, I often do this as I get older, and I think you become more sentimental. But I know now as I get older that I'm sometimes forgetful, but there again, some of life is just as well forgotten. And I eventually remember the important things, the wonderful loving care of my family, the many, many friends, most of whom have preceded me in death. I noticed the other day that there are only 3 World War I veterans still living. One of them just died in Ohio, so that leaves only 2. And we World War II veterans are dying at the rate of over 1,000 a day. But over the years, my heart has been broken from deaths and from experiences and so forth. But how can your heart not break when you lose a loved one or when a child suffers? But I think broken hearts are what give us strength and understanding and compassion. A heart that's never been broken is pristine and sterile and will never know the joy of being imperfect. But I'm so blessed to have lived long enough to have my hair turning gray and to have my youthful laughs forever etched into the deep grooves on my face. So many people have never laughed, and so many have died before their hair could turn silver. As you get older, it is easier to be positive. You care less about what other people think of you. I don't question myself anymore. I've even earned the right to be wrong. So I continue, only that I like being old, but I'm sure it is something that you can't stop. It has set me free. I like the person I have become. I'm not going to live forever, but while I am still here, I will not waste time lamenting what could have been or worrying about what I should have done. And to those privileged few who are still living and following what I'm doing, may you always have a rainbow of smile on your face and in your heart forever and forever. And may the road always be smooth before you and the wind be ever at your back. And I guess the message I want to leave, and as Chuck and Doug are so kind as to provide the opportunity, is that I hope I left this world a better place for having been here. I have always tried, but I've not necessarily succeeded at every opportunity. I have always tried, and I continue to try until my dying day. I loved, I lived, I participated, and I shall die happy. We raised a family of which I am very proud. I love you all dearly and equally, and I owe that every success I have had to my wonderful mother, my fabulous Mary Jane, and you all who are looking at this, whom I love very much. And to Jeannie, who has made my last years very happy. You have not only extended my life, but you have enlightened it, and you still do. So in discussing this situation with Doug, I've established kind of an interview format here, starting with my ancestors, how we got here in the first place. And I'm still looking for a very interesting thing that was written by one of the members of my mother's family. It's called Nuts from the Family Tree, but I can't find it, but I'll tell you, there were plenty of nuts that fell from my family tree over the years, including this nut that you're listening to right now. The Emilys came over practically on the Mayflower. The Emilys were my mother's progeny from originally, and actually, if we trace the Emily family back, our family would be eligible for the Daughters of the American Revolution or Sons of the American Revolution. And I started to do it one time, and then I thought it wasn't really worth the effort. But the Emilys came west into Wisconsin, and my grandmother, Emily, married Dave Houston. And Dave Houston always said that he was a cousin of Sam Houston out of Tennessee. So there were apparently two groups of Houstons that came this way, one to Tennessee. Sam Houston, of course, became governor of Tennessee and then left Tennessee and went down to Texas, where he made quite a name for himself. And David Houston, who was my grandfather, interestingly enough, I'm living in Signal Mountain, Tennessee at the present time. Signal Mountain is very historical because of the Battle of Chickamauga, the Battle of Cemetery Ridge, and so forth in the Civil War. And in tracing my grandfather Dave Houston back, I've discovered from the Smithsonian Institute that, and I have a copy of his discharge papers, that he fought here as a young man, 16 years old. He came down from Nashville. The Union Army had been trapped in Chattanooga, and there was no way they were able to escape because they were completely outnumbered by the Confederates. But General Grant marched a large group of Illinois volunteers and so forth. Incidentally, my grandfather at that time was from Illinois. They marched from Nashville down to Chattanooga and overcame the Confederates and freed the people who were being held hostage in Chattanooga. So I'm ending my life where really my grandfather Dave Houston began his life. And he escaped from the Civil War without injury, as far as I know, and went back to Illinois. Subsequently, went to Nebraska where he homesteaded and built a sod shanty out in the on the prairie. The sod shanties were made a good deal like the Eskimos build igloos out of ice. They cut chunks of sod and stack them up to the roof line, and then they build some sort of a framework for a roof over which they lay more sod. So they're actually living in a grass hut. And these places didn't usually have floors in other than dirt floors, and they had a big problem, of course, with rodents. But my mother was born in this sad sod shanty. Subsequently, they moved into Ewing, Nebraska, where they built a bed and breakfast. And my grandmother Houston was very well known throughout that part of Nebraska. And one of the things they tell about her was that she was in the kitchen preparing food for some of the people who were in her dining room waiting to be fed, cowboys and so forth. And she heard some loud talking and so forth. And she opened the door and saw that they were about to have some gunplay going on. And she grabbed an iron skillet and walked into the dining room and swinging the iron skillet and told them to get out of her dining room right now and take it outside. If there was going to be gunplay, it wasn't going to be in her boarding house. So she was a brave lady. And that bravery pretty much continued on down with the Houston family, because my Aunt Inez, who was one of the two daughters of the Houston, my mother was the other one. Her name was Desi. My mother's name was Desi, and my aunt's name was Inez, but she was best known as the nickname Babe. Anyway, she homesteaded out in Wyoming with her husband Date, because his nickname was Date Severs. He had just recently finished World War I, and they were given, the World War I veterans were given grants of land in Wyoming, 640 acres. And if they built a little house and stayed on the land for 5 years, then it was deeded to them. And my Aunt Babe and Uncle Date went from Ewing, Nebraska, out to Wyoming. He was subsequently killed by lightning, and one of my memories in my very early youth was when they brought him back to Nebraska for burial. There were no embalming facilities or funeral homes in the wild part of Wyoming from which they had come, and they brought him back in a pine box full of ice. And I can remember I was about 3 or 4 years old. We went down to the depot to meet the train because Uncle Date was coming home. And we went by the passenger exit on the passenger trains and went back to the baggage car, and out comes a pine box, and there was a lot of water running out of it. And I thought, it's kind of strange. Uncle Date was coming back to Nebraska in a box full of water, but of course his body had been packed with ice, and the ice had melted on the way back for his burial in Nebraska, where he was buried. Then my grandmother, Houston, whose husband had passed away, David had passed away, the Civil War veteran. My Aunt Babe said, why don't you come back to Wyoming with me and take a claim next to ours, and we'll have, instead of 640 acres, we'll have 1,280 acres together. So she talked my grandmother, who was then 68 years old, into going back out to Wyoming from Nebraska and taking up a claim. And after 5 years, they ended up with all this land. And my one admonition from my Aunt Babe was, when she left this land to my brother and myself, never to get rid of it. And fortunately, we never have. But that's the Houston part and the Emily part, and my mother's background very briefly. My father was born in this country, but he came, his parents came to this country by way of, from Europe, ostensibly Alsace-Lorraine, although at one of our travels I discovered Spittlers were in the Black Forest in Germany and were in Bern, Switzerland. But the Spittlers boarded a sailing vessel in Belgium, and came across to New Orleans. And they disembarked from the sailing vessel in New Orleans and came up the Mississippi River and disembarked near Duquesne, Iowa, on the eastern part of Iowa. And they bought up a bunch of horses and cattle and started west with them. And the weather became very intemperate with heavy rains and so forth, and the black Iowa soil was not conducive to them moving their wagons at that time, so they temporarily stopped and started a little town called Paris, Iowa. And they built a little brewery and they built a bank and got that thing started. And then within a couple of years after that, they decided to go on out to Nebraska, which they did, bringing cattle and horses, driving cattle and horses from Iowa out to north central Nebraska. And my dad was born during that era. My dad then went on to the University of Nebraska and College of Law and became a lawyer. He was always talking about the class of Naughty Two, which was the class of 1902 at the University of Nebraska. That's over 100 years ago. He practiced law in Ewing, Nebraska, and ran for Congress at one time, but was not elected, my mother said, because he refused to campaign hard enough. But he was a close friend of William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president on the Democratic ticket twice and was defeated and became famous in his later years for the trial that was held here in Dayton, Tennessee, relative to a law that was passed that you couldn't teach that the man did not come from God. And they set up a trial here, and Clarence Darrow represented the defendant, who was a school teacher and was teaching the man descended from apes, and William Jennings Bryan defended the law. Bryan was successful, and the young man was prosecuted for what it was, but the campaign was so severe that Bryan passed away as a result of that shortly after the trial. But I bring this Bryan thing up because my dad campaigned in both of Bryan's presidential efforts to become president. And then in those days, they campaigned riding on trains. They didn't have the methods of transportation that we have today. And the train would pull into a little whistle-stop town, and my dad, with three others, had a quartet, and they came up back on the back platform of the train and started singing until they drew a crowd. And then William Jennings Bryan, who was known as the Silver-Tongued Orator, who was a magnificent speechifier, would come and address the crowd, and then the train would move on to the next town, and the quartet would come and draw the crowd and so on. So that was his background, sort of, in politics. But after my dad's defeat for Congress, he did not thereafter participate to any extent in politics. But my mother was very active in politics, as Democrats. Both of them were Democrats, until Roosevelt ran for the third term, President Roosevelt. And when he ran for the third term, they felt that it was unconstitutional and that it was never intended that the president hold more than 2 terms. So they abandoned the Democrat Party and became Republicans, conservative Republicans. My mother was Democratic county chairman in our county, and during the Depression, there was a terrible depression engulfed this country from 1927, when all the banks failed, the banks closed, you could not get your money, and the Depression lasted until World War II, almost, in 1940, 1941. But the government had huge quantities of dairy products and so forth that they purchased from the farmers, who had no other place to sell their product because nobody had any money. And they gave the cheese and other items of that kind, they gave them to the citizens, literally, to keep many of them from starving to death. And the huge trucks would come to our house in Ewing, Nebraska, and unload this food in we had a closed-in back porch, and the people would line up around the block and come at our house, and my mother would pass out the food. And of course, the food was passed out, I would imagine, always with the admonition that, you know, this comes from President Roosevelt. So he became quite popular, giving away free food that the taxpayers had paid for. My mother was a wonderful woman. She was very active in the Red Cross. She was president of the County Red Cross. She was very active in her church. My mother's family were all Presbyterians, and the Houstons and the Emilys and so forth. And when my mother met my dad, he was a Catholic. And of course, the Catholics were required to marry Catholics and not Protestants. So my mother changed faith and became a Catholic. And she became one of the most ardent Catholics that could possibly happen. My dad was a very lukewarm Catholic, but my mother was very religious in the Catholic faith and always believed in her religion. And as a matter of fact, I served as an altar boy in the Catholic Church from the time I was 4 years old until the time I was about 16. And on several occasions, one in particular, I almost became a priest. I almost went in the priesthood. My mother and I were we were walking diagonally across the street one rainy night in this little town where we lived. The population was about 500, and they said the population always remained the same because every time a baby was born, somebody left town. But anyway, the population was about 500, and we were coming home one evening about 8 o'clock, and it was dark in the wintertime, and walking diagonally across the street. And in those days, the headlights on Model T Fords and so forth were not really adequate to see very far. And a car came around the corner and hit. I was able to jump back, but hit my mother, and she was under the car. And the Fords had 3 pedals on them that you had to use. One you pressed to go back, and one you pressed to go forward, and one was the brake. And the man that was in the car, the owner of the car, became so discombobulated knowing that my mother was under the car that he was pushing the pedals and so forth and going back and forth. And I was down on my hands and knees attempting to extricate her from under the car. And I prayed to God that if my mother was saved and that was not killed by this accident, that I'd become a priest. And I ultimately was able to extricate her from under the car. Her clothing was entangled in the undercarriage of the car. Finally got her out, and she was badly bruised, but nothing was broken, as I recall it extensively. And I, of course, never really fulfilled my promise to God. And I hope he doesn't hold that against me, because the time is getting very close when I've got the answer for some things when I get up there, if I do get up there. And I hope he doesn't ask me, how come you didn't be the priest that you promised me you were going to be? And I hope he understands why I didn't, because I found out about girls later on and found out about my beautiful Mary Jane. And I was never sorry that I didn't become a priest. Many incidents happened to us in this little town in Nebraska. And it was absolutely, my life, I don't know how my childhood could have been any better. This little town provided us with everything that we really needed. And we didn't know what big towns were. Everybody knew everybody by their first name, and everybody knew what everybody was doing. As a matter of fact, when my mother got out of high school, she went to work for the telephone company. And in those days, you had a little telephone on your wall, and it would ring, and you'd go answer it, and the operator would have connected you with somebody else. As an example, my mother worked in the telephone, what was called the telephone office. And if A wanted to call B, A would ring the phone, and my mother would answer, "Yes, what can I do for you?" And A would say, "I want to talk to B." And she'd say, "Well, I'll connect you." And then she would connect them if they were home, and she could listen in on the conversation. So she always knew everything everybody was talking about in this little town, although I've never heard her disclose any of the conversation. But this little telephone, I remember our number was 32, so you can. I expect maybe there were no higher numbers than maybe 100. And when you call it, this is my mother's name, as I said, was Desi, and the person that was calling would say, "Desi, this is 32. Please give me 78." And then she'd plug it in the thing, and 78 would answer. Or if 78 didn't answer, my mother would say, "Well, I just saw her going by over to the store. I think she's over at the store right now." And they'd say, "Oh, well, thank you," and hang up. It was a very close conversation. But my mother worked at this job a considerable length of time until she was married, and very diligently and carefully saved her money and invested it. And she was basically responsible for paying my limited expenses when I went to college. Many things I remember in this early days. I could tell so many. I had a brother, King. There were just the two of us. He was 2 years younger than I was. King was fabulous. I couldn't have had a better brother until the day he died. We were very close. I remember in our early childhood, I guess I was probably 4 years old and he was probably 2. And my mother had gorgeous long hair. Well, a style became into vogue called bobbed hair. Bobbed hair meant that they cut the hair off short. And my mother had the beautiful haircut off and had this bobbed hair. And my brother and I saw it, and we were just heartbroken. So we decided to run away from home. And we prepared a little sandwich, and we each got everybody out in Nebraska, everybody had their bandana handkerchiefs. Each of us got a little bandana handkerchief and put our sandwich in the bandana, and then you close the 4 corners, and then you take a stick and you tie it to a stick and put it over your head. And this is the way that the tramps walk down the road with a little bandana bag full of things over their shoulder. So we're going to run away from home. And this is about, I suppose, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're about maybe an hour from home. We'd probably gotten a quarter of a mile with our little legs going along. And my brother said, "I've got to go to the bathroom." Oh, he said, "I got to poop." He didn't say bathroom because we didn't have a bathroom. He said, "I got to poop." And I said, "Hey, King, we're running away from home. You can't do that." "I got to poop." So we kept on walking, and pretty soon he's walking kind of funny. And I said, "What happened?" "I pooped my pants and I'm going home." So he turned around and started for home, and that was the first, last, and only time that we ran away from home, and that didn't work out too well. But King and I slept together in the wintertime. It was very cold out in Nebraska in the wintertime, and I'm talking about 10 below zero, 15 below zero was not uncommon during the winter. And snow, we all walked to school because there were no school buses or anything like that. Schools never provided transportation. You had to get to school on your own. And so anyway, we had one warm room in our house at night, and that was the room over the kitchen. We didn't have central heating. Our only heat was from stoves into which you'd shovel coal or put corn cobs or wood or whatever. And the one bedroom, small bedroom, was over on the second floor. Incidentally, we had the biggest house in town. We had 6 bedrooms in this house, but no indoor plumbing and no indoor heat. So my brother and I used to sleep together in this bedroom that would remain warm because the stovepipe from the kitchen stove ran through that bedroom on the way up to the chimney, and it would stay warm until about 11 o'clock, and then it would get just as cold as the rest of them. And we always had about 5 quilts on top of us, and we'd huddle up, and every once in a while I'd make wind, and then I'd stick his head under the covers, and he'd scream and holler. My mother said, "What's going on up there? Jack stuck my head under the covers again." She'd know what was going on. But King was a good athlete. Actually, we were both reasonably good athletes by the standards of this little town. We participated in everything. And we were playing we didn't play tag football in those days when we were in grade school. We played tackle football, but we didn't have uniforms. And our uniforms in high school were very meager. No helmets like we have today, no face guards, nothing of any decency. But anyway, we're playing like we're like maybe in the fourth grade or fifth grade, and we're playing regular football. And King was carrying the ball on the other team, and somebody hit him pretty hard, and he didn't get up. And somebody said, "I think we better call the doctor." We had a little one-horse doctor, and I said, "No, he's faking it." And they said, "Well, how do you know he's faking it?" I said, "We'll take off his shoes and socks and drag him face down on the sidewalk over here and see how he reacts." So these guys, I don't believe it. Well, we took off his shoes and socks, dragged him face down along the sidewalk, and he didn't move or didn't say a word, so we knew that he was really knocked out. And that's how come we finally found the doctor, and he'd suffered a slight concussion. But he never did forgive me for dragging him face down with his toenails sticking into the cement. Very few of the homes in Ewing had inside toilets. We didn't have plumbing, and we had everybody to have a toilet, which was an extra building built out about 15, 20 yards from the house because it got a little smelly in the summertime. But you wanted it close enough to the house so you could get there to it without freezing in the wintertime. Anyway, one of the sports at Halloween was tipping over these toilets. And I got that up to be about 14 or 15, and the older guys started letting me go with them on Halloween to tip toilets. And my mother said, "You got to take your brother with you." And I said, "No, I'm not taking these two. He was not old enough to be in this gang." She said, "Well, if you're going, he's going. If you're not taking him, you're not going." So we took King along and dragging him along. And we get to about the third or fourth toilet to tip over, and it was a tough one. In those days, people would put fence posts next to their toilets so they were difficult to tip over on Halloween. Anyway, we finally groaned and grunted, got this thing tipped over, and as it was going over, my brother was still pushing, and he fell down in the hole. Okay, there he is now, and the temperature is like 10 above zero, 15 above zero, and he's down in the hole with all that excrement. See? Well, my buddies were abandoning it. They said, "We're out of here." And I said, "Help me get him out. He's your brother. You get him out." So I had to reach down there and pull him out of this hole. And I remember we had an outside water outlet, kind of a hose type thing. And I took him in this 20-degree weather and stood him out beside the house and hosed him down. He turned into an icicle. And he's screaming and hollering and jumping up and down. I'm like, "What's going on out there?" She came out, and that's one of the things that she never forgave me for, was letting him fall down in the toilet hole. I could go on with these stories. In the wintertime, we had incredible snowball fights. We had a huge amount of snow in the wintertime, and we'd have incredible snowball fights. We'd build forts, and we'd choose up sides, and when the competition got really keen, we'd put take a stone and cover it up with snow and make it snowball. You'd have a stone in this snowball, and you get hit with them and they'd sting a little bit. But one time, in the summertime, instead of having snowball fights, we'd have corncob fights, and we'd throw corncobs at each other, and we'd choose up, and we'd have corncob fights. So my brother was peeking out around the corner, and I had found a handle off of a plow, which was just about the size of a corncob, but it was solid iron. And I was carrying that for a special occasion. Well, he peeked out around the corner of the outside toilet, and I threw this piece of iron at him, hit him in the head, and down he went. Well, needless to say, it was some time before he forgave me to do that, for doing that. But when he came to, he started looking for me, and he was mad. And I remember he got a pitchfork, and we had a big barn with a haymow on the second floor, and the livestock were down below. And you pitch the hay down a hole that was in the floor of the second floor. You throw the hay down into the manger where the animals would eat it. So I knew he was down below in that barn, and he knew I was up in the haymow, and he didn't know how he was going to carry that pitchfork up, but he was waiting for me. And after a period of time, I thought he had departed. So I go look down the hole, down the haymow hole, to see where he was, and he sees me, and he throws his pitchfork and stuck in my chest. And I remember I pulled back and lay back. Here I've got this pitchfork. If you know what a pitchfork is, a 4 or 5 tine thing, very sharp. I pulled back, and the handle's about 3 or 4 feet long. I pulled back, and I had that thing stuck in my chest, and I had to pull it out. And that was the end of that fight. But we were never mad at each other in the sense that we didn't speak to each other because we had to sleep together every night, and we basically got along. But my brother was an incredible guy. We did not have allowances. In other words, you didn't go to your dad and say, I need 50 cents to go to the movies. And incidentally, the rate of exchange, the value of money in the 20s and 30s would buy a lot more. I can remember we would live on $1 a month or $1 a week almost. But anyway, you earned your own money. And we had many ways of doing that, my brother and I. We had magazine routes. We sold produce from my mother's garden, spring onions. We sold strawberries door to door. We sold packages of seeds door to door. Anybody see us coming, they'd duck away because they know we were going to try to sell them something. But we always had something going. And I was about 10 years old, and my dad said, why don't you start a cow route? And I said, well, that's not a bad idea. He said, I've got this big pasture outside of town here, right on the edge of town. And he said, everybody had a cow in those days. There was no such thing as bottled milk because pasteurization hadn't been introduced out in this area. So if you wanted milk, you either borrowed it from your neighbor who had a cow or you had a cow yourself. So probably 20 or 25 of the people in this little town had their own cow. And they had a little barn and so forth. So I went around to each one of them, and I made a deal with them that I'd pick up their cow every morning at 7 o'clock and drive it out to this pasture. And then at the end of the day, I'd go out and get their cow and bring it back and put it in their pen. And it proved to be a very profitable thing because I was picking up $15 or $20 a month doing that. And I had a white horse. We called her Hazel. She had been a racehorse and in a start had hit the starting gate and had become sweeneyed. Well, a sweeneyed horse is one that's has hit something hard, and the flesh, instead of remaining facile and moving with the hide, is stuck, and the horse had a very funny hitch in their get-along, as they would say. They got a little jerk on the thing. Anyway, this horse was sweeneyed, and the way they cured them in those days was they would cut a slit in their skin and drop a silver dollar down in there and let that silver dollar work around in there, and then the flesh got loose from the hide, and they'd go in at the bottom of and cut it and take the silver dollar out. But we never tried that with this horse. But anyway, I had this horse at the time, and my dad had paid $10 for the horse. He had heard that there was going to be a horse sale out in one of the ranches, but he was tied up and couldn't go, so he asked Jack Berrigan, who was a cattle and horse buyer, to buy a horse for King and myself. And he had heard that there was going to be a pony for sale out there. Well, it turned out that the pony was this retired racehorse. She was the nearest thing to a pony. She was not really a quarter horse, but she was a little bit larger than a quarter horse. Anyway, this horse was so smart, it was unbelievable. And she'd come up beside the gate. I wouldn't even have to get off the horse. I'd just reach over and take the wire off the corner of the gate, and she'd move out, and we'd open the gate. The cow would walk out into the street. We'd close the gate, go to the next place, get another cow, and I'd go down the main street of this little town about 7 o'clock in the morning with about 20 head of cattle. And the streets weren't paved or blacktopped or anything. They were dirt. And, of course, the cattle were leaving plops of their stuff on the way to on the way to the pasture, which wasn't very popular with the people walking across the street, but this turned out to be a very good business for us. And this horse became a very important part of our life. All the kids had horses, and we would race them winter, summer. We'd race them on the ice in the wintertime. We'd race them in the rivers in the summertime. We just literally lived on our horse, and this horse became a very important part of our life. And shortly after that, we got another horse. King and I were sharing Hazel, and I was getting more out of it than he was, and he wanted his own horse. So my dad said, well, we'll give you Hazel, and I'll get Jack another horse. Well, he got a horse for me that wasn't broke, and he had one of our cowboys break him, and that means break him to ride. A horse is not just naturally a timid animal. When you get on them when they haven't been ridden before, and they buck, and they really buck on many occasions, and they keep bucking until they decide that it's easier for them not to buck any longer, and then they become what's called broke, and you ride them like people do normally. Anyway, this horse, the cowboy told my dad, he said, he's broke now. So I get on this horse, and it immediately starts to buck, and it was bucking, and I'm on the horse, and the horse goes over backwards, and at that age I became almost killed because as the horse went over backwards, I was still in the saddle, and the saddle horn, and a Western saddle has a horn on the top of the saddle, as opposed to an English saddle, which doesn't have a saddle horn. And you have this saddle horn on there because when you're roping cattle, you throw the lariat, and then you tie it on the saddle horn, and the horse stops, and then snaps the cow, or whatever you're doing, and then you get off of the horse and brand the critter, or you do whatever you're going to do. But anyway, this horse went over backwards on me, and the saddle horn came down and tore all the skin off the side of my ribs, but didn't break a rib, and it had been over about 2 inches farther, it would just have crushed my ribs, possibly my heart, and would probably have killed me. But that was one of my incidents with a rough horse, as I was a cowboy and didn't know it. One incident, we had a half a dozen or so of us used to ride out across the plains, racing our horses and so forth. And at this period of my life, we had prohibition in this country. That meant that it was illegal to sell alcoholic beverages anyplace. You could not buy a bottle of beer that had alcohol. You couldn't buy whiskey. The only way you could get it was from what they call bootleggers, and the bootleggers would go into Chicago or someplace where they had big bootleggers bringing liquor in across Lake Michigan and so forth, and they'd bring it out across the country and sell it at a highly increased price, of course. And this was during the era when Al Capone and the gangsters were pretty much controlling alcoholic beverages in this country, which were illegal. So anyway, Jakey Butler was the local bootlegger. He had a Model A Ford. A Model A Ford was subsequent to the Model T. Henry Ford built half the cars that were built in 1914 were built by Henry Ford. And in 1916, the statistics show that Henry Ford built 600,000 Model T Fords, and they sold for $360 a piece. Imagine that. A brand new Ford car for $360. But that's the difference in the value of a dollar then and the value inflated as it is now. But anyway, the Model T was succeeded by the Model A. And the Model A was a pretty fast car. Anyway, the bootlegger, Jakey Butler, had a Model A coupe with a rumble seat in the back. So anyway, we were talking about Jakey Butler. We were out riding our horses across the plains, racing them, and as we usually were, and so forth. We saw this Model A Ford, which we knew to be the bootlegger, because he was the only one in town that had a Model A coupe like that, and it was alleged to have been souped up, which means that it would do 100 or 125 miles an hour and could outrun any sheriff that was chasing him if they saw him with a load of booze in there. And in his rumble seat, instead of having the seat in there, he had a big empty compartment where he could haul liquor out from Omaha or Chicago and sell it out in our country. Anyway, we're running across this hayfield, and there are haystacks in the hayfield where they stack up the cut hay and feed it to the animals during the winter. and these haystacks are all over a hay meadow prior to the time they'd been fed, and this was in the fall. So there were a lot of haystacks out there. We saw Jakey come out into this hayfield and pull up behind a haystack and stop his car for about 5 minutes maybe, and then the car appeared on the other side and he went back in toward town. Well, naturally, we were inquisitive as to why he would be stopping beside this haystack. So we went over to the haystack and started digging around, and we found 5 burlap bags full of gallon cans, unlabeled and so forth, except that they had the stamp AC on the bottom when the can was manufactured. So we tied our lariat ropes around these sacks and drug them over to about three other haystacks and buried them in these other haystacks. So a couple of days later, I'm coming home from school or doing something downtown, and I feel a tap on my shoulder, and I look around, and here's Jakey Butler. And he said, I want those sacks back. And I said, trying to act dumb, what do you mean? What sacks are you talking about? You know what sacks I'm talking about. I'm talking about those sacks of mine that you and your gang hauled off from behind that haystack. And I said, we didn't haul any. He said, don't give me that crap. He said, you got 24 hours to put those sacks back where you got them. And he said, I might tell you that if you look on those cans, he said, the initials AC are stamped on those cans. And he says, AC means Al Capone. He said, I got those cans in Chicago from the gangster Al Capone, and if I don't have them back in 24 hours, they'll be out here with machine guns, and it'll just be the end of you guys. So Jakey says those cans will be back in that haystack within 24 hours. You kids are going to be in very serious trouble. So I immediately got a hold of my people and said, we better get on our horse and go out there and take a look at those cans. And if they, in fact, do have AC stamps on the bottom there, we could be in real trouble. So we get on our horses and we go out there. Sure enough, on the bottom of each one of those cans is stamped AC. But we couldn't get those cans and that sacks back to the haystack from which we had taken them fast enough. And I mean, then we heaved a big sigh of relief. The next time we saw Jakey driving down the main street of town, he just waves at us, so indicating that he's gotten his cans back. About 2 years later, my dad and I are pheasant hunting out in that same area. And we're walking across this field before the grass had been cut. And those grassy fields were great for pheasants during the day. And we get out there. I'm telling my dad this story about the cans with the AC on. He laid his gun down on the ground and just bent over to laughing as hard as he could laugh. And he said, do you know what AC means? And I said, yes, it means Al Capone. Of course, that's why we put the cans back. He said, AC stands for American Can. He said, those are the people that manufactured those cans. He said, they were full of alcohol. He said, do you know what each one of those cans of alcohol were worth? I said, I don't have any idea. He said, he'd probably get $100 a piece for them. He said, how many of them were there? And I said, well, there had to be 15 maybe. He said, you guys just kicked away $1,500 thinking AC meant Al Capone instead of American Can. Anyway, Jakey he made a lot of money, and then the law was changed back so that you could buy liquor and beer legally. But I remember that most everybody made their own beers. You weren't going to deny the American public the ability to have a drink when they wanted to, and they either bought their alcohol, their liquor from a bootlegger, or they made it themselves. And my dad, who liked his beer, he never drank much really, I mean, he never had an alcohol problem, but he made home brew. And we had a crock that was about this big around and maybe about that deep, and he put in his magic formula, which everybody had, which consisted of malt and water and hops and all the things that you made beer with. And you made your own beer. And he set the big crock behind our cook stove. And he had a hygrometer. And every once in a while, he'd look at it fizzing away. And you could smell, if you walked in our kitchen, you could smell the beer because it was brewing in the kitchen. He put the hygrometer in there. And whenever it hit a certain point, then he knew it was ready to be bottled. And we had bottles, and we had a capper. We'd put caps on them and set them down in our cellar, which was under the kitchen. So one day, my job, you had to have a long piece of rubber hose, and you stick one end of the rubber hose in the big crock where the beer was, and then you'd suck on that rubber hose until you could taste it in your mouth, and then you'd stick it in the bottle, and then when the bottle got full, you'd pinch off the rubber hose and set it over here, and another person would be there with the capper, and they'd put the cap on, and then the next one would come and so forth until the entire thing. And you could usually get about 20, 25 bottles of beer out of each one of those batches. So one day my dad heard from somebody that if, when you were putting the caps on, you tipped a half a teaspoon of sugar in there, it gave the beer an extra kick and would add about 5% to the alcohol, which was in the beer, which in that home brew was already about 10%. I mean, a bottle of that home brew would really knock you on your butt unless you were an experienced drinker. Anyway, we did this on this one batch of beer, and then we proceeded to take it down in our cellar, which is where my mother stowed her canned goods. She used to can things. I mean, put them in mason jars, tomatoes, strawberries, and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, we put the beer down there. About 3 nights later, in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, all over the house we hear this bam, bam, bam. Well, we lived close to an Indian reservation. My dad always had a .38 pistol under his pillow because we actually feared, and that's another story, but it'll be the next story I tell about the Indians. But anyway, King and I are in the little bedroom up above the kitchen. We come running down the stairs. My mother and dad's bedroom was right off the kitchen, and they came running out. My dad had on his long winter underwear. He had this .38 pistol in his hand, and he's snapping on the lights, looking around, trying to figure out where it was. And all of a sudden, we realized that this bang, bang is coming from the cellar. So he goes over and he throws the cellar door open. And about that time, one of the bottles broke and went sailing by his head. He slammed down the cellar door on it. Finally, when the explosion had completed, we opened the door and we're all standing there looking down. And the whole basement is covered with beer and broken glass. This extra little zip he was putting in the beer was too much for the bottles, and they all blew up, and it sounded like a machine gun fuselage down there. But I'll never forget him running through the house in his winter underwear with the gun in his hand looking for Indians. But my sister-in-law's father, whose name was Boone Stotts, lived in Cody, Nebraska. Cody, Nebraska was about 200 miles farther west, and we were almost to the Wyoming border. And Boone Stotts was a typical Western character. He made his money playing poker. The railroad ran through Cody, Nebraska into Omaha, and he'd get on, when the train would stop there in the morning heading for Omaha, he'd get on and he'd start a poker game, and he played poker all the way into Omaha with the salesmen that were riding the railroad. And when the train turned around, was going back out, he'd get back on the train and ride back out to Cody playing poker. He was a very successful poker player and made enough money that he literally started the little town of Cody, which had about the same population as our town of Ewing, about 500 people. And Boone, like my father and his brother, Spittler brothers, literally owned the town with respect to the businesses. Boone had a liquor store, he had a grocery store, he had a garage, he sold cars, he sold tractors and so forth, and owned the town. Anyway, it was illegal to sell liquor to Indians. They had to get it to wherever they could from bootleggers or whatever. One night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Boone hears this knocking on his door. He gets up and goes to the door, and it's an Indian. "Me want liquor. Me want whiskey." "Me want whiskey." Boone said, No, get away. No. "Me want whiskey." The Indian was drunk. And Boone said, "No, get away." And the Indian grabbed the screen door and yanked it open and forced his way into Boone's living room. And as Boone is moving back, he gets back to the fireplace, and he had wood stacked up at the fireplace, and he picks up a piece of wood. And this Indian kept coming at him, Boone says, "Get out of my house." He wouldn't get out of the house. Boone hits him alongside the head. Down he goes. He's laying there. Boone got to figure out, God, I got to drag him out. How am I going to get him out of here? So he starts pulling on him, and the guy wasn't moving. So he feels his pulse, and the Indian is dead. He'd killed the Indian. He hit him in the temple. So here you got this dead Indian in his living room. So he goes to the phone and calls the town marshal. We didn't call them cops in those days. The guy who was the sheriff of the town was called the marshal, the town marshal. So he calls the town marshal. The marshal came up, and Boone explained the circumstances to him, and the marshal said, "Well, thank God you didn't drag him out." He said, "If you'd drug him out, then we got a different situation. But here, he's obviously invaded your home, and you were defending your wife and your blah, 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 blah." So they had a hearing the next day, and it lasted about 5 minutes, not guilty, and that was the end of that. But that's part of the alcohol liquor store. As I said earlier, we made our own spending money. We never got a penny from our folks. Nobody that I know of would ask their folks for money, because if you wanted money, you went out and made it. And this was a fabulous character builder, because my entire life I was that way. I don't think I got more than $1,000 total from my dad from the time I was born until the time I died. I just never asked him for money. And the only reason I had this $1,000 was because he loaned it to me to buy our first house to make the down payment on it. But we made our own money. And I can remember my dad told me, I'm about 13 or 14, he said, "I've got a job for you out on the Shavlik Ranch." And I said, "Doing what?" And he said, "Well, you got to furnish your horse. You get $1 a day, all you can eat, and furnish your own horse." I said, "What would I be doing?" Well, he said, "You'd be working on a ranch." He said, "It'd be a good experience for you." So I went out there, and for 3 months, I earned $30 a month working on this ranch. And you talk about hours. We got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, went out and harnessed the horses. And the harness that you put on a horse weighs about 60 pounds. And you throw that harness on, and then you attach all the different buckles, and then you go out and you hook the horse up to the rake or the mower or whatever. Everything was horse drawn in those days. There were no mechanical things in the field. And so I worked 5 o'clock in the morning. We'd get to bed usually about 9 o'clock at night. We'd pass out. You'd literally pass out. But we were working solid. We'd go in for dinner, and dinner was the noon meal. We'd go in for dinner, and we'd take an hour off. He'd let us have an hour off, and we all flopped on the floor in the living room or wherever and took a nap for an hour, and then got back out, because that heat in Nebraska summers gets up to about 100, 105, and it stays that way from about 10 o'clock in the morning until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But anyway, I got $1 a day, and it was I learned more about rounding up cattle, branding cattle, castrating cattle, doing all the things that are essential to run a major type livestock operation. It was an incredible experience. Anton Shavlik, he had a son who was about 7 years older than I was, and at that time I was about 15, I think. Anyway, on Saturday night he'd go to town. He'd take me to town with him, and he'd get drunk, and I'd sit in his car, and finally it's time for him to come home. And his favorite sport was knocking over mailboxes with his car. He'd get that car up to about 50 miles an hour and hit these farmers' mailboxes that were on posts alongside the thing. It's a wonder that none of them ever came through a windshield and killed us. As you can imagine, sports were very important in Nebraska. There were few, if any, other things to do. I mean, in those days, of course, we didn't have television. We had radio, but the reputation of the University of Nebraska football team is well known, and they've always had fabulous football teams. As a matter of fact, Nebraska went to, I think, 32 consecutive bowl games up until the last year or two, when they had this goofy coach they hired from the pros, and he tried to coach the college kids like he taught the pros. And this last season, I think he won 2 games and lost 12 or something like that, which was the absolute worst record that the University of Nebraska football team had ever had. But anyway, the major portion of Nebraska teams consisted of kids who were raised in Nebraska. And this was one of the things that the university always prided itself with, because I can remember when I was in college, 95% of the kids that played were products of Nebraska high school. In these later years, that has changed because they're getting a lot of kids from Florida and places like that in order to compete. And they're playing a lot of black kids, and there are few, if any, black kids in Nebraska. As a matter of fact, I was, I think, 18 years old before I ever saw a black person. And I was 18 years old when I played against the Harlem Globetrotters in basketball. This was kind of a funny thing. I was a freshman in college, and I came home for Christmas, and I had just gotten home, and one of my buddies came over and said, "Hey, we need you to play basketball tonight." And I said, "What are you talking about?" "Well, we've got an exhibition game here, and we need a fifth person on the team." And I said, "You mean you can't get 5 guys to play? You want me to play?" "We can't get 5 guys. You'd be the 5th guy on this team, and we got to have him for the exhibition." I said, "Who are we playing?" He said, "The Harlem Globetrotters." I said, "You got to be out of your mind. What are they doing there?" "Well," they said, "they're going through, and they're playing an exhibition game, and we got to get 5 guys out on the field." So we played the Harlem Globetrotters, and the score, as I recall, the score was like 45-3 or something like that. And I was a high point scorer on our team. I got 2 free throws. They just could do anything, of course, with you that they wanted to, upside down, inside out, or so forth. But I digress. Back to high school. Football was especially very important to high school. As a matter of fact, 7-man football was first started in Nebraska because at that time these smaller schools couldn't get enough guys to play 11-man football. And this brought football to some of the smaller schools that didn't have football by playing 7 men. As a matter of fact, we never, at our high school, we never had 22 guys out. We never could scrimmage another team with full members because we usually had only 17 or 18 guys that came out for football. But we had some great football teams. As a matter of fact, I was quarterback on one of our high school team when I was a junior. That we had the highest scoring team in the history of our high school. We beat one team 76-0, and you think that's a laughable matter, but you get so tired. They'd kick off to you, you score a touchdown. Kick off to them, 3 and out. They'd kick to you, score another touchdown, back and forth. I thought we were going to drop dead, and as I said, we only had 17 or 18 people, and everybody was playing. And in those days, you didn't have unlimited scoring. Once they took you out, you couldn't get back in, so you had to be kind of careful about your substituting. But I played high school basketball, high school football, baseball, and we played an awful lot of pickup stuff on Sundays. The big thing on Sunday afternoon out in Nebraska and many of those western states are baseball games, pickup baseball teams. One town playing another town, It was just basketball and that kind of stuff was very important out there. And as a matter of fact, I'll digress again because talking about football, Mary Jane's mother and father, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law were fabulous people. It was Earl Brannon, and her name was Cosette Brannon, after whom we named Cozy, our daughter Cozy. We named Cozy Elise Cosette Spittler. We named her after my grandmother, whose name was Elise, and after Mary Jane's mother, whose name was Cosette. So we thought Elise Cosette was a very beautiful name. And of course, we gave it to a very beautiful person who has meant a very great deal to me throughout my life. But they both graduated from the University of Nebraska. He played football at Nebraska. Earl Brannon played football there. And his wife was on the cheerleading squad and all that kind of stuff, kind of a big gal on the campus. very active in Chi Omega sorority, and as a result of her having been a Chi Omega, Mary Jane was a Chi Omega, and then Cozy became a Chi Omega. But one of his jobs before World War I was football coach at Arkansas A&M. And this was during the Depression when they probably got maybe $300 a month. And he did not have a coaching staff. He had one or two people on the coaching staff, but coaching college, he did not have a staff because the school didn't have money enough to hire that many coaches. So the second year he was there, I think, he wanted the freshmen to scrimmage the varsity. And he had asked Mrs. Brannon to coach the freshmen and teach them the plays and all that kind of stuff. And anyway, turned out that Mrs. Brannon, Cosette Brannon, was the first female college football coach in the history of our country. And we have a full-page article from the Omaha World Herald, which is big, with her picture down one side and extolling her acumen as a coach, because in the game, big spring game between the varsity and the freshmen beat the varsity, and she was the coach of the freshman football team. Anyway, they ultimately went to France at the end of World War I. He was involved with the YMCA, and the YMCA was very big in those days in the armed forces because they taught all the calisthenics and all that kind of stuff. And that's where Pat, their oldest son, was born in Germany during that period of time. But I can't say enough about my mother-in-law and father-in-law. They both died prematurely. Mrs. Brannon died at age 52. She had had rheumatic fever and had a bad heart that ultimately took her life. And her husband, Earl Brannon, Colonel Brannon we called him, died at 62. So they didn't really live out as full a life as we're living in now. Other things that we did in high school, we had a band. And this is kind of interesting. We didn't have enough people. I remember when a fellow by the name of Shimonik, John Shimonik, was hired as the music instructor in our town, our high school. And he started the band. So my mother wanted King and I to be in the band. And instead of asking us, what instrument would you like to play, the trumpet or the clarinet or whatever, she goes to John Shimonik and said, what instrument do you need the most in your band? And he said, well, we need baritones, baritone horns. He said, we only have one baritone, and we should have three. He said, we need Well, my mother buys a baritone, and we played the baritone, not because we wanted to play the baritone, but because that was what Shimonik needed. And our town was so small that at the halftime, the kids that played football, also, about half of them played in the band. Instead of going over the plays and so forth to the coach, he had to relinquish his authority on the football players at the halftime so they could play in the band then they come back and start the second half playing football. But we had a good band. As a matter of fact, I got to be pretty proficient. And I won a couple of state tournaments playing the baritone horn. And my brother got pretty good too. But it was a great experience because it got us to associate with some of the kids that we normally wouldn't have associated with through athletics alone. We played in the band with them, and we had a great experience. And it was very interesting. Back to my father and his brother, Spittler brothers. I shouldn't say owned this little town, but they had their finger in everything. Whether it was the bank, whether it was law, whether it was automobiles, whether it was tractors, everything but groceries. They never did get involved with groceries, but they sold windmills. As a matter of fact, my dad, I remember him mentioning one time that they bought the first train car full of windmills that came west of the Missouri River. It was shipped out to our little town, and everybody out there had windmills. That's the way you pumped your water for your cattle and so forth. And of course, now windmills have become very famous, producing electricity and so forth. But were they alive today and still in the windmill business, they'd be pretty big because they sure sold a ton of those windmills. I used to work for them after school or whenever I had time. I'd go down and work around in the law office, sweeping out the law or sweeping out the office or stalking shotguns. They used to sell shotguns and shotgun shells. And I remember one corner of that building, they had the biggest building in town, and one corner of the building was their sporting goods. They sold shotguns and shotgun shells and fishing tackle and all that kind of stuff. I used to be in there. I used to like to be in there talking to the guys who were hunting and so forth and selling them their shotgun shells. And Doug, you'll be interested in this. Shotgun shells in those days, 12-gauge shotgun shells, maximum load, sold for $1.10 a box. And the lighter loads sold for 95 cents. Some of them, I remember Federal, Peters were the big shell selling in those days. But Federal would sell, I think those were 85 cents a box of 25. 22 rifle shells were 15 cents a box for shorts, 20 cents for long, and 25 cents for long rifles a box. Though they were in everything. My uncle Lee was kind of the treasurer of the company and the secretary and so forth. And my dad was, I don't know whether he was president or whatever, but my dad was a great hunter and fisherman and dog lover. And to his dying day, he had a car that was his fishing car. And in that car, there was nothing but fishing tackle. And I mean, you could smell it when you got in because catfish bait, fishing for catfish, you usually use rotten chicken guts or something like that. And of course, we used a lot of angler worms, and they got smelling up the car. But man, you could smell that car of his. I can remember when I was visiting him on occasion after I was living in Ohio, and he did a lot of fishing. But my dad was kind of a peculiar guy in that he was never involved in school affairs. He seldom went to a school event. My mother was always tremendously active in school activities, school affairs. But my dad never was that active. Once in a while I'd see him coming in late for a football game and leaving early or something like that. And I suppose it was because he had other demands, business demands or whatever it was. I never faulted him for it. But the one thing that we did together was hunt. And he taught me hunting from the time I was 3 years old. As a matter of fact, I think I was like maybe 5 or 6, and King was like 4, and we both wanted BB guns for Christmas. And my mother told my dad, no, they're too young to have these. No, they got to start someplace. We'll give them both BB guns. But I'll explain to them how dangerous these can be and so forth, and that they shouldn't shoot certain things in certain directions. Never point a gun at anything you don't intend to kill, and that kind of stuff. So comes the eventful Christmas, and we both got BB guns. They were lever action, and the harder you wanted them to shoot, the more air you pumped in them. You could pump them about 4 times and get an average shot, but you pump it about 6 times, and boy, to get out there a little farther, we shoot a little bit. So we're using targets, well, Sears Roebuck catalogs or whatever we set out there and we'd shoot into them. One day King said to me, my BB gun's more powerful than yours. I said, no, that's it. No, he said, they aren't. We get in an argument as to whose gun's the most powerful. I said, I tell you what we do. I said, you get out there, walk out there a ways, and I'll holler when you're far enough. And you pull down your pants, and you point your bare butt at me, and I'll shoot you, and then I'll turn around, and you can do the same thing. You can shoot me, and we'll see whose gun's the most powerful. And he said, well, how are you going to tell who's the most powerful? I said, we'll see who jumps the highest. So to find out, he said, well, who's going first? And I said, well, we used to do it. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a nigger by the toe. If he hollered, let him go. You're it. And that would be the first, something like that. So we started that thing, and King lost. So he's got to go out there, and I hollered, that's far enough. What do you think? He says, okay, I'll pull down my pants, and you take a shot at me. So he pulled down his pants and faced me. I banged him in the butt. He jumped about this high and screamed at the top of his lung, went running in the house. Jack shot me in the butt! Jack shot me in the butt. My mother came out and says, I knew you kids shouldn't have had those guns. She said, you're too young to have those guns. She yanked my gun away from me and says, you're not getting this young man for another 6 months or whatever it was. So from that day forward, old King had marched by me with his gun over his shoulder. Yeah. I didn't have the gun for 6 months because I had shot him in the butt at his request. But this wasn't an accident, of course, this was intentional, but he was hunting with a buddy of his, and I suppose they were maybe 15, 16 years old, something like that. But anyway, they'd been walking, and they stopped, and his buddy took his gun, and instead of holding it while they were resting, he rested the end of the barrel on his foot, and they're standing there talking, and the first thing, he discharged the gun, and it went down between his big toe and his next toe and shot off that toe. And there they are out in the wilds trying to get back. And I asked King one time, I said, what was the thing that bothered you the most? And he said, watching his shoe fill up with blood, and it kept squishing as we were walking. We always had great hunting dogs, and we never let them in the house. My dad would not permit them to come in the house because he said it spoiled their nose as far as smelling, being able to smell game was concerned. They always slept out on the back porch. And we had one dog in particular, Max, who was a black mixed breed. I think it was Llewellyn Setter, maybe, and Lab, but it's a great hunting dog. And somebody stole it. And this was not uncommon. Anyway, probably 6 months or 8 months, something like that, had elapsed. And a guy came into my dad's office and said, you know, I saw a truck going through here, a pickup truck, and I swear it had Max in the back of that pickup truck. And my dad said, what was the license number? You remember? He said, yeah, it was 7. Well, 7 was Norfolk, which was another county on down about 50 miles away. And I said, do you know where this guy's going? He said, no. But he said, I imagine he's going to Norfolk. And he said, I kind of know where the guy was. And he said, he's usually at a bar in Norfolk, such and such place, because he sufficiently identified it that my dad thought he could find it. So my brother had just come home from school or something. It was a little kind of late in the afternoon, about 3 or 4. And he got my brother and said, come on, we're going to go. I think we can find Max. So they go to Norfolk and they go to this bar, and there's the dog. And my dad goes in the bar and says, whose dog is this out there? And the guy says, it's my dog. He said, would you mind coming out here a minute? And the guy said, what do you want? Well, I said, I want to check that. He said, I'm not sure if that's your dog. And he said, what the hell are you talking about? Of course it's my dog. My dad said, come outside. Well, you call somebody outside and you're going to have a fight. So anyway, they went outside. And my dad said, that dog is mine. And he said, I'm going to prove it to you. So he told King, he said, go across the street and just say 2 words, Max, Max, and see what happened. And he says to the guy, if that dog jumps out of that pickup and runs over there, your ass is in trouble. So King goes across the street and hollers, Max, and old Max jumps out of the truck and goes running across the street. See? And the guy said, I bought him. He gave him a big excuse about he hadn't stolen him, he bought him from somebody. But that dog, this was 6 months after he'd been stolen, jumps out of the pickup truck and came back to us, and we continued to hunt with him until the day the dog died. It was a fabulous dog. We always had good hunting dogs, which were essential to hunting pheasants. You couldn't hunt pheasants without dogs. And then when we were married, we started raising Brittany's to hunt with. And I had told Mary Jane, I said, you know, these dogs have to be kept outside. And she said, well, we never kept our dogs outside. And I said, no, because you had poodles or you had this bulldogs or whatever. And of course you kept them in the house. But I said, don't let these dogs in. Anyway, about the second or third day we had this first Brittany, I come home and the dog's in the kitchen. About the fifth or sixth day, the dog's in our bedroom. From that day forward, Brittany slept at the foot of our bed all during the time that we had those Brittany. But speaking of dogs, I'll tell you how important dogs were in Mary Jane's life. When her dad was coaching at Arkansas A&M, it was the day before Christmas, as we are today. It was Christmas Eve. And school was out, I guess, during that period of time. Anyway, her dad was home alone because Mary Jane and her mother had gone shopping to get a few things for the last minute before Christmas. And Colonel Brannon fixed his own lunch. Then he went in his easy chair and laid back and fell asleep. And about 2:30 o'clock, the dog, they had a little bulldog, a Boston Bull. The dog's in his lap, yakking at him, waking him up. And the house was on fire, and the dog woke him up, but the house had burned long enough that about all he could do was get out of there. I mean, he didn't have time to grab anything, just he and the dog, and out they went. And about that time, the roof collapses. So they've always said, literally, that that dog saved his life. But the side issue of that is that Mary Jane and her mother come home like about 4 o'clock, and here's the fire department all out there. The house burned to the ground. Christmas Eve, all their Christmas presents were in there. Everything they owned was in that house. All they had was the clothes on their back and the few Christmas presents that they had bought that day. But the little dog was attributed to saving his life. Other jobs I had when I was in high school and in college were working in the creamery. We had a creamery in this little town where people on the farms brought their milk and cream and so forth and sold it to the creamery, and the creamery made butter out of it and sold the butter all around the country. And it was tremendous work because they usually hired 3 or 4 football players during the summer because we were doing real heavy work. Those 5-pound cans of cream weighed about 60 pounds, and we'd handle one in each. We'd unload cars with those each word. And we also sold feed, bran and oats and wheat and stuff like that were in 100-pound bags that were shipped in railroad cars. And we'd take them out of the railroad car, take them down, put them in a truck, and haul them over to where the creamery feed shed was. And I can remember at one time we were at a point where I could put 2 100-pound bags on my shoulders and walk them out, especially when the pile got down just about shoulder height. So you could just flip them up on your shoulders, walk out with 100 pounds on each shoulder, and go down and put them in there. And then after work, we usually closed up about 5 or 5:30. And we had a little lawn out in front of this creamery. And we'd have a wrestling contest after work. And we'd get out there. After working all day, they would be out there wrestling for about 2 hours in the heat and so forth. But it was a great experience for me. I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed it not only because I learned a lot of discipline in my life, but because of the friends that I made there who were very instrumental in my high school life, all football players and so forth. That's kind of the extent of my childhood. I could go on with 1,000 stories, but I was raised in a very loving family, particularly my mother. She was the greatest influence in my life up until the time that I married Mary Jane. She was a wonderful woman, most honest. I've never known her to to lie or in any way take the name of the Lord in vain. She was very devout. She was very devoted. My dad was not as loving to her as I oftentimes thought he should have been. And I think that there were many times when I tried to give her the love, maybe that I felt rightly or wrongly, that she had been denied. But I just can't say enough about Desi Houston Spittler. And that's kind of the end of my childhood.